Typically, when people think about disaster recovery, they think about, a backup or a restore or the individual component of the application. Um, this is focused more on the broader scope of the application, meaning its entirety, not just the database, not just the web, not just any middle tier that's out there, not just restoring a file. It's sort of the entire operation per se. Right now, the current DR strategies that are prevalent in the industry are active deployment, meaning you have a standby running at a separate site. It's usually either at a hosted data center or up in the cloud, corporate data center colo, or up in the cloud, and you're just moving data back and forth. That's fine. The problem with that is that it has high operational cost, high resource cost. If you own the hardware, you have hardware on both locations that's fairly similar in revision and horsepower based. The other one is just using geo-redundant storage. A lot of customers are under the impression that just replicating the data between two sites is enough. Well, maybe it is for files or things like that. Other customers are running hypervisors with virtual machines on one location, and then they replicate their virtual hard drives to another, and that may work. The problem with that is that there's no application consistency. If the application becomes corrupt, it's corrupt in both places. And really, it's a little bit difficult to assess what your recovery time objective is going to be because you don't know how the machines are going to come up with or going to come into the state they're going to come into, if they're going to be corrupted, if they're not. And then also you have that cost, factor, right? Maybe it's a little bit less than having active, but there's still some cost you're covering. Maybe the secondary site isn't as powerful as the first one, but that's still there. Or replication using third-party tools. There's Veeam, there's multiple replication strategies out there. Again, that doesn't necessarily guarantee that you're going to recover from a failure. Now, a failure can be geographical disaster, nature-based, act of God,
like hurricanes and fires.
A lot of people have their two data centers within less than 500 miles of each other because it doesn't, for them, it's, the corporate locations here will just have it down the street. Well, if something floods, it's probably going to flood down the street. So you really don't have a full DR solution.
But I think the other reason why people normally like that is so that they can drive to it, right? Because sometimes they'll lease a cage, right? And they'll buy the hardware. They got a good price break, and they're like, hey, I gotta. I don't want to have to fly a long distance to go do this. Let me go do that. And sometimes it's maybe network performance reasons why they may want it.
You have infrastructure outages, power goes out, same thing. Or simply you just have, telco outages. Usually a colo has multiple circuits, blended circuits, but it's always, a factor.
Mm-hmm. Cool. One thing I wanted to bring up, so it was an interesting point you brought up, even when they're doing replications or whether it's a natural disaster or sometimes, natural disaster, stolen, sometimes just breakdown, right? Something bad broke down, but if something happens to your corporate office and you have a lot of other regional office dependent on it, you can't just not be, functioning. So the whole business continuity part of it, but if you did have a natural disaster and it did go down, but you did have that other data center that's working or that colo, I would bet money that during that time your colo is going to go down, not because of the same disaster, perhaps, but we've all been there. Like for some reason, the IT powers that be have decided that that's the day my other hardware goes down at the same time. And that's the only other ones that I have, and I've spent a lot of money on those things. So it really doesn't give me a lot of choice, what's going to happen. So that's why I think what we're going to talk about the solution now gives us a lot of that flexibility.
Well, also the complexity of the solution, right? Yeah. You want mostly your IT staff will need to be involved in bringing that secondary site up. If there's a fire going on, like currently in California, or if there's a natural disaster, they're probably going to tend to that first before bringing up the application.
Yeah, great point.
So we had another session about this. Can't recall specifically the date. I think it was beginning of this month. Yeah. We touched about server migration using ASR, Azure Site Recovery. That's the other primary use that this tool has, as Conrad mentioned before. A lot of the content, a lot of the operational principles on how to do the protection and how to do the configuration are on that tech talk. So Conrad, We covered a lot of it there. There's a link that's provided at the bottom of the screen there. The main difference here is that, again, when you think about migrating a server, you usually do it in units. It's a single machine. It's a single function I want to move. This covers more the grouping of servers and having certain servers start in a certain sequence, because maybe you want your database starting before your web app. So it's there servicing it. So then you have to reboot it. The deployment steps are pretty much the same, but.
Well, the other interesting thing here is that while we're going to talk a lot about the context of using this to essentially fail over to the cloud, you can actually fail over to another data center if you wanted to, right? So it's not exclusive only to Azure. So even like in this scenario, you can go from a primary site that's physical even to a secondary site or another site. So it makes that overall infrastructure to do it. So even if you said, well, is this only good if I'm going to do it in the cloud? Something to consider. But we're going to talk about the benefits why you should put it in the cloud and perhaps even leave it there. But you're right. So we did go through a lot of steps for those that did go through this session. We're not going to bore you with those details. You remember. For those that didn't, you should go check it out. These two sessions complement each other pretty well.
Okay, so we covered that portion of it. Like you said, you can fail over from data center to data center. ASR gives you that benefit of orchestration, which is the main piece of this whole thing. Is as long as you're connected, you have storage, you have your connection points. Azure will take care of moving the bits between one side and the other. Now, it does require connection to the cloud. It doesn't go site to site laterally as it's logically shown in this slide particularly. Excuse me. But it does require the cloud for orchestration. Now, this is sort of an abstract view. Right now, it's basically saying, if you were to use the concept in its purest form, meaning a primary site or your co-location site using ASR up to Azure, which is on the right-hand side, first thing you would need to do is you would need to have that site-to-site VPN at the bottom. Two main reasons for it. One is if you have services that you want to be running in that network or in that location before you fail over, or as maybe you want to have a monitoring machine, or maybe you want to have something there that is there and it's working prior to you failing over, because even though you're using ASR, if the source of the failover is a corrupted machine or something of that nature, then if you fail it over, the result's going to be the same. So you want to have that network configured to go from your primary location up to the VPN tunnel up to Azure, or multiple site-to-site VPNs if you're servicing multiple branch locations. So this is just an abstract view of one.
Right, but that's important because if you have an application that's a line of business application that's used internally, now that's on the cloud and there's no connection to it. I mean, how are people going to get access to it unless you made it put on the public IP, right? But if it was like let's say it was an external application, like let's say we had a small web app server and a database box, and people only accessed it via public IP, would they still need a site-to-site VPN?
For management, probably. If you want to manage the server, if you're doing IaaS, you probably want to manage the server. You don't want to have their remote desktop ports open to the entire world. So I would see some benefit there.
So if you access it via kind of internal things, it's good. But if it was like an isolated thing, you probably don't. So site-to-site VPN isn't required by ISR, but it is required because if that's how you access it or manage it, it's a fundamental piece. Cool. So, and then we have here on the left kind of that grouping of items and kind of in a scenario. So, kind of explain what is that?
So this is basically representing an application that uses built-in or NT authentication, which relies on Active Directory. There's a web tier, an application tier, and a DB tier. So basically what this is doing is, if let's assume you decide to protect this sort of an application, well, you can do it a couple of ways. You can do a mixture of technologies. If you're using SQL Server on-prem, you can use SQL Server Availability Group to protect the databases up into the cloud as either an IaaS, VM, or PaaS. In this particular snapshot, they're using a machine that's live in Azure to be part of the availability group. Secondly, it's using ASR replication to replicate the web and application tiers. The application tier can be a worker service that pulls data from other tertiary locations, as a web service, a JSON call, whatever. Web tier can be exclusively a presentation that talks back to the application, retrieves the data, as any traditional app would do. This scenario, replication, you're only consuming resources in Azure for storage if the VMs are not live. So you're not using any compute resources. This is where the cost benefit comes in. And then finally, Active Directory, the authentication piece. There's two ways you can do it. If you're tightly coupled to Active Directory, particular revision of the NTDS database or authentication, replication may work, may not work. Usually you want to have a node or a domain controller in your Azure site natively receiving Active Directory replication. That should be close enough, unless you need to go prior to a replication cycle, because this also requires you to optimize or properly configure your Active Directory schema to identify different subnet, different site, things like that.
Yeah, one thing that we had talked about in the previous video was, this is where you're alluding to a little bit on the cost, is when I'm doing ASR replication between these things, it's not that that there's a virtual machine running in Azure at the same time, and that it's basically a hot copy or even a warm copy. It's actually none of those, right? It's collecting the data at a given state at a interval we talked about in the last video. So when we either decide, hey, we're going to force this thing over, like let's say, not to pick on our state of California here with the fires, but the fire's coming. I could plan to have this done. Go, you know what? I'm going to force it over right now, just in case, right? So I can do that, or set up a policy and a rule. So middle of the night, I'm out with my family, we got to get out of here, and the server dies. That ASR in the cloud has seen that interruption. Go, oh, you had a rule that says if that happens for this amount of time, I just kick things on now and get it turned on. So me as an IT person, I don't have to deal with that. So this is where the cost benefit is. Like, that VM wasn't running, it got spun up on the policy, and now it's running on that site. So going back to this though, in that previous video, we talked about it for migrations, we're kind of consciously, we're saying one by one, but you do group migrations by whatever pair, but you gotta say I'm moving these things one by one. If I were to just move one thing for an application, like a line of business application, if I just move the web server, there's no database, did I move an app, right? So I need all the things that I need with it. And this example, you have a database, you have some app tier things for processing, web tiers for UI or web services, and then even the authentication piece of it. So if these are the fundamental pieces that I need to run this applications, that's really what should be part of my group, if you will. Is that right?
Right. And ASR also gives you the flexibility of telling you exactly what needs to come on first. Because a lot of the times, even though you have your machines protected, you don't want them coming all on at once at the same time. Because, well, one, there's dependencies. Second is, what if the application or the service on another server that's dependent on the first one isn't there? It'll fail. So that's prolonging basically the downtime that you're having. Because if it's, may need to reboot again, then maybe it's not set to auto reboot. So then you have that manual factor there. So if we go, Conrad has.
Yeah, let me also, because some people, when they look on the left, they'll say, well, where is it? I don't see it in here. All services, and I like to show this sometimes. There's a ton. Don't try to find it. Just type recovery. And then actually, if you put a little star on it, sticks it in the side, and then you can actually drag and drop and put it where you want. Little fun tip for you today. Okay, so now we'll go into this. We have this. This is the same the same recovery vault that we used in the previous video. So where do we go now? How do we describe this grouping of an application?
Well, the previous video we showed the protection, how to do all that. So this time we're going to show the operational side of how to get it, back up and running. So you would go to recovery plans, and we have a recovery plan here, which basically just says, hey, if a machine goes down, we had a single machine on-prem, it's failing over to Azure, fail it over by itself. That's fine. But what if there are more machines? What if the recovery plan, this is just a recovery plan in here. It's not really defining the elements that make up this recovery plan. So if you were to click on that one, if you were to go to general right now, we really don't have any item. If you go to the settings blade, There's really
sorry.
no, the one next over.
I magnified it to make it easier, and it's actually making it harder for me to navigate around, but I think it's easier for people to see on the screen. So, okay.
So if you go to general and click on that, right now it says there are no replicated items found in that particular recovery plan. Now, of course, if you had multiple protected, actively protected items, they would show up here.
Okay.
For the sake of this conversation, we're just going to create a new one or customize the recovery plan. And in the bottom section is where you would say groups or all groups fail over. You would just say, hey, I want to have multiple groups. This grouping of machine goes first. The group can be one or many machines. And then after group one, group two, so on and so forth. Now, you can go real in depth with this, and you can actually go with actions that happen prior. You can test failover. You can run a script after it fails over. If there's a particular setting or connection string that you need to change, you can have a PowerShell script to read the config file, change the IP, or change the name of the server. Usually server names are going to remain the same, but we still see from time to time people that use IP addresses for connection string.